Lovely to see so many familiar faces, and it's absolutely wonderful to hear the stories and the songs, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. So I thought tonight I'd like to tell you one of my father's stories. For those of you who knew Jack Sheen, he had a wonderful way of weaving words together, and he created some really memorable stories. We're working on gathering them together and collecting them. But I think in the meantime, for those who know them, please keep telling them and keep them alive through the stories. So this is one of those that he told me. One of my earliest memories is of sitting at the AGA Cooker that sat in my aunt's house. And I sat in the heat of the cooker on a mat beside it. And I can't remember whether I was petting a dog or a cat or playing with a doll, but I remember sitting there. I was maybe 3 or 4 years of age. And across from me at the table was my mother and my aunts. They had just been into town to do the shopping, got whatever the daily bits were. In those days, you went each day and you got your bread and your milk and your meat for the day. And then they came back to swap the news over the 11s, this very important cup of tea that was a central part of all of our lives growing up. But my mother was a blow-in. She had come from the city down to the country, and so very often the conversation had to be explained. So it might go bits like, oh, Mrs. Murphy is sick. I heard Mrs. Oh, you know Mrs. Murphy. You do know Mrs. Murphy. She's married to the butcher there down on Main Street. You do. And her sister, they haven't talked for years. They had a falling out years ago about something or other. Or did you hear that Tommy Nolan, his limp is getting worse again. You know, you do know Tommy Nolan. He'd be walking every day down by the river with the dog. You know that black and white dog that yaps at everything and it'd be coming up to bite your heels. Well, so the conversations would go. And on this particular day, they were talking about an elderly man at that time who lived about 1.5 miles up the road from us, a man by the name of Tom Murphy. And my mother made some comment as to him being a bachelor. But my aunt said, oh no, he was married, and then tried to withdraw the remark as though it was something they should never have said. And it was that moment of trying to take back what they had said that stuck with me. Now, it was years and years later before I ever heard the story of Tom Murphy, but it was a story worth hearing then, and it's the story I'm telling you now. Tom Murphy lived about 1.5 miles up from our house in a little cottage, typical of its time. You walked in from the road in along a long driveway, and the cottage stood with a door in the middle and a window on either side. You went in the door and you turned to the right, and there was your bedroom. You turned to the left and there was your sitting room, come kitchen, come everything. There was no electricity or running water in Tom's house. He lived there in the house, happily enough. He had a bit of land and a few sheep. He had the cow. Everyone had a cow in those days, gave him his milk and his butter that he needed. But the lands that he had, the fields that he had were full of gravel and sand. And so the majority of his living was made by letting people come in and pay him to draw the sand and the gravel they needed for whatever building work was going on. Tom did marry. When he was in his 30s, he married a woman about 10 years his junior, a Maisie McGrath from over the hills, from a little village on the other side of the hills in that area. And they were a quiet enough couple. Once a week, Maisie would take the eggs from the chickens and the butter that she had left over from the cow, and she'd go into the market in the town and she'd sell what she had to sell and buy what she had to buy. And then on a Saturday evening, the two of them would dress up in their best clothes, in their Sunday clothes, and they'd walk the 2 miles into the town together. And Tom would go to the local pub where he'd play a few games of darts or rings and have a few pints. And Maisie had been taken under the wing of some of the women in the town who wanted to look out for her. And she'd sit into one of the guest houses there where they'd gather together and they'd play a few hands of cards. Now, all this was, it was years ago. It was back around the time, actually, it was at the time when the first of the Americans were coming back to trace their roots. And there was a guy in the area that everybody knew because he had a car and nobody else had a car. They still had their ass and car in those days to get from place to place. But this guy, everybody knew him. He'd be driving around and he'd let the kids in to beat the horn and open the doors and up and down the windows that were on the car. He was in all the graveyards checking the headstones. And if you had the right story, the right surname, and something to tell him that might be connected to his family, sure, you could get a lift to wherever you wanted to go. You could get a meal out of it and a few pints, definitely. And so this guy was known all around the area. Now, Maisie and Tom, their life went on, and there were a few nights that Maisie would say that she was sick, or nights that Tom called to the guest house and he'd tell the women, Maisie won't be in today, she's not feeling too well, and he'd head on and play his few games of his rings or his darts and head home again then around midnight. But there were nights that Maisie'd be in playing the cards with the women and she'd say, I don't feel so well, I leave now. Now, the guest house that they played the cards in was just across from the church, and she knew if she got out early enough, she could get a lift home with the last of them coming out of confession from the church. And so there were a few nights that she said she wasn't so well and she'd leave, and the women hoped that she'd be better soon. But there was one night that Maisie was in the house with him, very agitated, couldn't rest at all, and coming up to watching the clock, she says, I'm not feeling too good, I think I'll go home. And they said, oh, are you all right? Will we send for Tom? No, she said, don't bother him, he's having his few pints, that's fine. If I go now, I'll get a lift home with someone coming out of confession, sure, it's only 2 miles up the road. And they said, oh, okay. The lady of the house walked her to the door and opened the door to let her out. And Maisie couldn't contain herself. She turned to her and she said, I'm going tonight. And they said, yeah, you're not well, you're going home. No, she said, I'm going. The American, he's taking me away with him. We're going away tonight. And off she trotted. Now, the women were in shock. You didn't leave your husband and run off to America with a stranger, as it seemed to them. But that was what was happening. And they wondered, they spoke among themselves and said, well, what will we do? Maybe we should go up and tell Tom and get him to go home and talk some sense into his wife. But then they thought, oh, Tom wouldn't want us knowing his business. No, they decided, no, we'll say nothing, we'll pretend we know nothing, and we'll let them deal with it themselves. And so when Tom called around midnight onto the door and knocked on the door and asked for Maisie, and they said, oh, she wasn't well, she went home early. He turned on his heels quite quickly and started to walk his way home, a brisk pace down along the road. Now, the women had decided it was best that they keep things to themselves and they not tell anybody what was going on, and they let Tom and his wife sort it out themselves. And so it was that by 8 o'clock the following morning, the entire town knew what had happened the night before and about Maisie running off with the American. When Tom didn't turn up at Mass that morning, sure, they weren't surprised. Could you blame him, they said, after that, what that poor man is after having to face? Could you blame him not coming? Say nothing. Say nothing at all. Let him deal with it his own way. And so that was what everybody agreed to do. Well, sometime after that, the postman came and he says, do you know that Tom has cleared out all of his kitchen stuff, all of the stuff inside his house is outside, and he's painting the walls and he's putting down concrete floors. He says, oh, would you blame him, poor man? His wife after running off on him. He probably wants to get rid of every sign of her ever being in the house, have a whole new start. Say nothing, let him deal with it his own way, let him on with it. And then the farmers were complaining, Tom wouldn't let them draw sand or gravel from the fields anymore. Oh, they said, can you blame him, poor man, after all he's been through? You know what, say nothing to him, let him deal with things in his own way. Sometime later, the train in the station master was reporting that Tom was getting the train up to Dublin. He's going up for the day and coming back again. Sure, he knows nobody up in Dublin. Who would he be known in Dublin? And they said, look, if Tom wants to get on the train and go up to Dublin for the day, let him. We say nothing about him, let him deal with things in his own way, let the poor man be. When I was a small child, Tom was an old man, and we were told just to leave that man alone. When you saw him coming, you crossed to the other side of the road. He showed didn't greet anybody, and we didn't greet him. Let that poor man be. We didn't know at the time what had happened to him, but we were just told, let him be. He's had enough to deal with it. Say nothing to him, let him deal with things in his own way. Not long after that, news came that Tom had sold up his house and he was moving up to Dublin, where some order of priests or nuns were going to look after him in his old age. That was the deal he had made. He'd give them the money from the house and they'd look after him and they'd see to his burial and everything else. Very strange, people thought. I'd never heard of anything like that. But then Tom had no children of his own to look after him. He had no nieces or nephews to look after him. And if that's what he wanted to do, well, then let the man be. Hadn't he been true enough? Say nothing, let him deal with things in his own way. the house was bought by a young couple who were planning to get married in the near future. And it took them about a year before they were ready and had saved up the money they needed to get to work on the house. And sure, there was everything to be done. There was no electricity or running water in it yet. So all that had to be done, and a new bathroom put into it, and septic tanks sunk and a well dug and all of the works. And it was while they were working on that, while they were setting the pipes into the house, that they found the two bodies buried under the floor in the kitchens. Two skeletons of a man and a woman in their early 30s, they guessed, and between them lay a shovel. And people started to remember what they thought they had known had happened the years before. Now, the guards went up to see Tom, and at this stage he was bedridden. He was hooked up to machines and things, and the nurse who was looking after him said the conversation went something like this. The guards came into him and quite gently they said, "Tom, we're after finding two bodies buried under your floor." And Tom said, "At last, nobody ever asked. She was with me one day and she was gone the next, and nobody ever asked." And he went on to say about how he had come home that evening and found his wife packing up the car to run off with the American, and she was laughing and joking, and she said that he was boring, that she was bored with her life with him. And he took up the shovel in a fit to smash up the car, this fancy car that was there outside his house, and she jumped in front of him to stop him, and he hit her. And then the American came and jumped to try and save her, and he hit him as well. And he buried the two of them under his floor, and nobody ever asked. And he took the car and he brought it out into the sand pits, and he buried it in under the sand there, and nobody ever asked. Well, you might wonder if you'd heard anything about this. At the time, it was in the newspapers for a bit, but because he had admitted to what had happened, there wasn't, and died very shortly after that, there wasn't much more that was, it didn't make the news much more after that. But in my town, we remember that story, and we remember it to our shame. And we hope there'll never be another time when somebody can say of us, nobody ever asked.